And US President Donald Trump hit out at his favorite target, the news media, after what he termed as a successful strike on Syria. Donald Trump tweeted, and I'm quoting, "The Syrian raid was so perfectly carried out with such precision that the only way the fake news media could demean was by my use of the word mission accomplished. I knew they would seize on this, but felt it is such a great military term. It should be brought back. Use often is what the president says." Meanwhile, reports have emerged on how Donald Trump approached the Syrian crisis days before the strike. Donald Trump reportedly attended multiple briefings per day. Reports also say that John Bolton, the newly appointed National Security Advisor, and Defense Secretary Jim Mattis were the key advisors to Donald Trump for these strikes. Some reports also say that it was Jim Mattis who stood up to Trump. After the strikes began, some U.S. officials have been quoted off the record as saying that Mattis sounded more presidential than the president himself. Mattis's main aim, according to reports, was to just attack Syria's chemical weapon capabilities and nothing more. Let's broaden this up. Glenn Carl, American writer and former intelligence officer, is joining us from Boston. Also joining us is Nicholas Grossman, international relations professor at the University of Illinois. Good evening, gentlemen. Appreciate your joining us. Let me come to you first, Glenn. We've heard so much of what U.S. President Donald Trump claims as mission accomplished. Has the mission been accomplished? What was Donald Trump's mission? From what reports say, it would do nothing to alleviate fears of the Syrian people on ground.
Well, there are several kinds of missions and accomplishment that we could evaluate here. And in the narrow sense, which is where Trump is sort of trying to hide and claim credit for and focus attention, is, yes, it was a well-executed mission that accomplished its objectives. But that's the least consequential point. The larger issue is, what is the mission of the United States? Here, too, you can argue, and as you know, I have been a consistent, severe critic of Trump. The mission has been relatively successful, and that is to send a message by an international, not only U.S., coalition that the use of chemical weapons is crossing a line that we should not accept. The mission has not been accomplished, that mission, when you look at the capability of Syria to continue using chemical weapons. It's easy to destroy a site. It's essentially impossible to destroy the capability. So their partial success probably achieving what can be achieved. The largest question, and ultimately the most important one for the U.S. and the Middle East, is what is the U.S. mission? What should one entity seek to accomplish in the Syrian conflict? And there, the United States remains conflicted, as certainly Donald Trump is. He's an isolationist and wants to leave and wants to impose American will at the same time for peace, which is an impossibility given the multiple seven-dimension existence of the conflict. So multiple answers to mission accomplished.
Multiple answers, multiple viewpoints as well. But one that is crucial and that stands out, Glenn, is coming in from Sarkis Kasargian, a Syrian political analyst. I want to take that to Professor Grossman. What the analyst says is that U.S. presidents love to make war, and they do so when they have domestic troubles. Many reports also suggesting that this was an attempt by U.S. President Donald Trump to divert attention away from the domestic concerns.
I think in this case that is nonsense. And I'm not saying that could never happen under any circumstances, but in this instant, Donald Trump did not somehow get Syria to use chemical weapons. The Syrians didn't use chemical weapons against civilians as a favor to Trump. The UK and France did not attack Syria as a favor to Trump because of his domestic politics. France and France's president, Emmanuel Macron, were among the ones in front who were arguing for a strike and who put out evidence of the strike that it actually was Syria, it was Assad, it did kill a bunch of civilians, which the United States did not do. And on top of that, America's domestic problems aren't going away.
Okay, then.
So if really hypothetically, sorry.
Go ahead.
If hypothetically the point was to distract people, one limited strike that lasted a day and will be out of the American news cycle within a week at most is not really the way to do it. and it doesn't account for what the Europeans were doing. So that strikes me more as an excuse to dismiss the serious issue of chemical weapons use against civilians and the much more difficult issue of the Syrian conflict, what the United States, what the international community, what other countries, including Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, will do in that conflict.
How do these strikes address the root problem of alleviating fears of Syrians, Professor? Would these strikes be successful in limiting Syria's chemical weapons program as intended?
Possibly. I think limiting the damage to Syrian civilians and all the harm that they've suffered will be very minimal. The Assad government and its international supporters have killed many thousands more civilians using conventional weapons, especially using something that they call barrel bombs, which is an oil drum packed with explosives and shrapnel. The numbers that they've killed with chemicals is only in the hundreds. So this is not really alleviating the suffering of the Syrian people. To the extent these specific strikes were connected to a strategy, it was to show the world and show Assad specifically that there will be a price to be paid for using chemical weapons, that it crosses an international line, it violates international treaties, and therefore that somebody can't do it without paying some sort of price. But overall, I wouldn't expect it to change much of the conflict on the ground, nor do much to alleviate the suffering of the Syrian people that are caught in the middle.
Glenn, if these strikes were successful and mission accomplished, as U.S. President Donald Trump is claiming, why is he upset? Why lash out at the news media? Is he feeling the pressure of the U.S., of the scrutiny of the U.S.-Syrian policy?
Well, by now, I think everyone who listens to the man will be past frustration with his all-defining narcissism. And whatever the subject, whether it be his sexual life or war and peace and everything between, unless a reaction to him or comment about him or his actions is in total praise and agreement, he will deride it, denigrate the individual or the entity. That's systematic. That is not an exaggerated assessment.
Professor, do you agree?
I think so very much. That the last time the United States fired some airstrikes into Syria in response to a chemical weapons attack, Trump received a lot of praise, especially from the American news media, also from people in the Democratic Party, which happens very rarely. This time there was less praise. Part of the problem is that the domestic politics in America have soured even further, as if that were possible, but it seems to keep souring, and that he seems very upset that he isn't personally getting praise for it, much like he did before. And so I agree with Mr. Carl that that's the best way to view his statements, through a personal ego narcissism, as opposed to speaking on behalf of a country or the international community.
Glenn, also the aspect of how there was a tip-off. Was Donald Trump just playing to the galleries? Was this entire strike staged, as many are asking?
Well, in a sense, I'll make a distinction. The strike was very carefully conducted, and if one listens to General Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, and Prime Minister May, one can then hear a coherent, cogent exposition of what the objectives were. So it was carefully done so as not to harm Russians or to, frankly, endanger the stability of the Syrian regime. If the Russians and the Syrians are intelligent, and they are, they will realize that the trend of events has gone and continues to go their way in Syria. Assad fundamentally is the victor there because of Russia, and the regime is unchanged, and America is not becoming, by this action, and carefully showing that it is not becoming more involved in whatever the future is going to be. Our role is and seems to be to maintain, this is against Trump's own will, our troops in the northern areas, so as to maintain a de facto Kurdistan, while not so alienating Turkey that we have problems in the NATO alliance. Beyond that, the U.S., this action does nothing, and the U.S. shows no inclination to move any further.
Professor, also the usage of the term mission accomplished and Donald Trump's encouragement for using that term often, quote unquote, It's a historically loaded phrase. It's become a code word in a way for any mission that was not particularly accomplished. Of course, Bush's usage of the term over the last 15 years has haunted America as well. So what do you make specifically of the usage of the term mission accomplished?
Well, it recalled President George W. Bush announcing mission accomplished in 2003 after the United States overthrew Saddam Hussein. And obviously, the Iraq War had a lot to go, that there was a lot of ways that it went south after that. So the phrase is loaded in the U.S. context. I don't know exactly what was on the president's mind, on President Trump's mind. I think it's easily possible that he didn't know the history of it or just said it. Alternatively, that maybe he wanted to recall it. But also, I'd like to comment just once on the Syrian conflict itself, that it's evolved quite a bit. So there are really many conflicts in one, and in the conflict in the east, in Damascus, in eastern Ghouta, and other areas where the Assad government has consolidated control, over the last 4 years since Russia intervened, Assad's forces have effectively won there. And with the United States trying to get involved in the UK and France at this point, that there was a very difficult decision in that a strong attack on the regime could possibly destabilize that part, which, through brutal use of force, Assad and his allies have managed to at least partially stabilize. And then there's another conflict that is going on in the northeast of the country. That was the area that was controlled by ISIS and now is currently controlled mostly by Kurdish forces in a group called the SDF. And that's one where the United States is involved with on the ground. And so keeping those two, thinking of those almost as two separate conflicts at this point, albeit they overlap, the United States is much more involved in the one involving the Kurds, ISIS, Turkey in the northeast. And so the goal here, in part, was to maybe stick a toe into the conflict with Assad versus the rebels, but not to disturb that too much, because if Assad was weakened substantially, Russia and Iran would then escalate further, which would end up causing more suffering to the Syrian people, not less.
Glenn, do you agree? And thanks to the usage of the term mission accomplished by the president, do you agree that there is a certain aspect of an Iraq deja vu here? The phrase was used by Bush as well 15 years ago. It came back to haunt him. The banner with those two words, of course, is still an image that strikes America. The phrase has become a code word in a way for any mission that was not particularly accomplished, despite a politician's claims to the contrary.
Well, the phrase has come to mean that in the American context, certainly, yes. I think Bush's use of it was an act of hubris. I think Trump's use of it is an act of petulant narcissism. I think he had less grandiose claims and more self-referential intention to provoke and draw attention to himself. Beyond that, one shouldn't look for too deep a meaning in anything that the man in the Oval Office says. And I do not intend to simply be disparaging, although it clearly is disparaging. He is utterly tactical and in the present. I don't find a lot of strategic thought in his utterances. Some of his actions have some intentional objectives, but his commentary tends to be reflexive. It's the boy in the playground who is taunting and responding.
And Professor Grossman, protests have reached the White House as well. I mean, people are questioning the basic intention of the United States. Those placards say, make peace, not war. Do you not feel that the U.S. president is feeling the heat of those protests?
I think he is somewhat, though he's faced a lot of protests since he was elected, and much larger protests for issues of domestic policy or of his personal conduct than for international policy. I think perhaps he expected more praise than he got, but overall that line of protesters of, we want peace, not war, is unfortunately in the case of Syria is really oversimplistic, that the Syrian civil war is immensely complicated. Everybody wants peace, or I'd say just about everybody wants peace. The problem is that the peace that they want is different, that many different actors, and besides, there's Russia, Iran, Israel, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Jordan, the United States, ISIS, other jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, various Syrian rebel groups, and I haven't even named all of them. And many of them have different visions of what they would like the peace to look like, which is why so often attempts to have a negotiated solution have failed. So I think that perhaps the president is feeling a little bit of pressure, but mostly the peace in Syria is not something that the United States can bring about. At least not without a massive military occupation, which the U.S. has no interest in doing. And so given that peace is not an option, the United States with these attacks didn't make the war worse in any appreciable way either.